Thomas Hayes hadn't heard his daughter laugh in many months, and something was hurting them from the inside, so he needed to find out what was happening, which is why Thomas Hayes did something really surprising because he told his girlfriend he was going away for 3 weeks. Then he dressed up like a different person to become the new gardener at his own house, and on his very first morning there, he heard yelling coming from inside the house. So he walked toward the noise, and what he saw through that doorway made him stop moving completely because his hands started shaking when he knocked on the back door at 6 in the morning when it was still dark outside, and a young woman answered the door whose name was Susan Miller, and she was the house helper, and she smiled in a really warm way at him saying, "You must be Jake and please come inside." Then she walked him through the yard and showed him all the tools and explained what work needed to be done. And he kept his head looking down at the ground and made his voice sound rough like he was pretending to be a man who really needed this job to make money. But his heart was beating really fast because somewhere inside that big house were Emma and Sophie, who were his 6-year-old twin daughters, and he hadn't seen them smile in such a long time that he had actually forgotten what their happiness sounded like. And around 8 o'clock in the morning, his girlfriend Victoria came outside onto the terrace wearing her fancy silk robe, and she looked at him like he wasn't important at all and said in a cold voice, "So you're the new gardener, and let's hope you're better than the last one who worked here." And Thomas kept his eyes looking at the ground and said, "I'll do my very best, ma'am." Then she walked back inside without saying another word to him, and he let out a big breath slowly because she didn't recognize him at all, not even a little bit. So he worked without talking for the next hour while he trimmed the bushes near the side of the house and pulled out weeds from the garden while staying very alert and paying attention, and then he heard it, which was a voice that sounded sharp and angry coming from inside the house. So Thomas put down his tools and moved closer to the sound, and the noise was coming from the living room. So he stepped up to the doorway and looked inside to see what was happening. And Victoria stood in the middle of the room, standing really tall over Sophie and his daughters. Small body was pressed against the wall with her hands shaking at her sides and her eyes looking really wide and full of fear. Then Victoria grabbed Sophie's wrists, but not in a gentle or loving way because she yanked her forward really hard. And Victoria's voice sounded like ice and fire mixed together when she said, "I told you to set the table before breakfast, so are you stupid or just lazy?" And Sophie's lips started trembling when she said, "I forgot, Miss Victoria, and I'm really sorry." But Victoria said, "Sorry doesn't fix anything," and then pulled her closer saying, "Your father works so hard for you and you can't do one simple thing right." And tears started sliding down Sophie's cheeks. And across the room Emma sat frozen on the couch staring down at her lap and not moving at all and barely even breathing. Then Victoria hissed at Sophie saying, "Look at me when I'm talking to you." So Sophie lifted her chin up even though her whole body was shaking, and Victoria said, "That's better, and now get upstairs both of you because there's no breakfast for you today and maybe being hungry will teach you to think better." So the twins ran up the stairs holding hands and silent like ghosts, and Thomas stood there in the doorway completely frozen with his chest feeling tight and his vision getting blurry. And he had thought something was wrong, but actually seeing it, and witnessing his daughters living in fear and being treated like prisoners in their own home broke something inside him. And he wanted to scream and tear off his fake beard and charge inside and end this right now. But he couldn't do that yet because he needed more proof and he needed the world to see what he was seeing. So he stepped back from the doorway and picked up his tools and kept working. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. And deep inside him something cold and hard settled into place because this was going to end soon. And before we begin, you should know that if you've ever felt invisible, or if you've ever had to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves, then this story is for you because sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be even when it hurts us. So please stay with me. And his best friend Michael stared at him saying, "You want to do what?" And Thomas said, "I'm going to tell Victoria I have to go to London for 3 weeks for business meetings that can't be changed." And then Thomas's voice got quieter when he said, "And then I'm coming back as someone else." So Michael set his coffee down slowly and said, "Rich, you're talking about disguising yourself and spying on your own girlfriend." But Thomas said, "This is the only way I'll see the truth because she's different when I'm not around, and Michael, my daughters told me that, and I need to know what different really means." And Michael said, "You could hire a private detective who's a stranger." But Thomas shook his head saying Victoria would figure that out in a heartbeat because she's too smart and too careful. So Michael rubbed his face asking, so you're going to become what? And Thomas answered the gardener, because our gardener quit 2 weeks ago and the position is open, so I'll apply through the agency that Victoria uses. And Thomas's eyes got hard when he said, and I'll watch what happens when she thinks I'm gone. And Michael said, this could blow up in your face. And Thomas said, I know. Then Michael said, you could lose custody and lose everything. But Thomas's voice cracked when he said, I've already lost something, because my daughters don't run to me anymore, and they don't climb into my lap asking for stories, and they barely speak. Then he looked out at the city saying, if I do nothing and she's really hurting them, I'll never forgive myself. And Michael was quiet for a really long time before he finally nodded and asked, what do you need? And it took 3 days to disappear, because Thomas found Peter Walsh, who was a British actor who couldn't pay his rent. And he hired him to make video calls while pretending to be him. Then he went to a costume shop in Brooklyn and paid with cash, and left with a fake beard and skin makeup and brown contact lenses that would change his eye color. And he bought old worn jeans and faded work shirts from a thrift store in Queens. And every night he practiced in front of the mirror by making his voice lower, and hunching his shoulders and moving like a man whose body had been shaped by many years of really hard work. And by the third night, when he was standing in his bathroom at 2 in the morning, he barely recognized himself anymore, because the beard made him look older, and the makeup made his skin look weathered and rough, and the contacts turned his blue eyes brown, and he looked like someone that life had beaten down, and he looked like Jake Miller, and it scared him how easily Thomas Hayes disappeared. And telling Victoria was harder than he expected, because they sat on the terrace at sunset when the sky was burning orange. And he said carefully, I have to go to London because the investors want face-to-face meetings for 3 weeks. And Victoria's face stayed calm, but it was too calm, and she said 3 weeks is a long time. So he said, I know, and I'm sorry. And she smiled, but something cold moved in her eyes when she said, it's fine, because the girls and I will be fine, and we'll finally have real time together. And Thomas's stomach twisted when he asked, you sure you can manage everything? And she said, of course, and her smile got wider when she said, they're too dependent on you anyway, and some space will be good for them. And that night Thomas pretended to sleep, and around midnight Victoria got up and he heard her voice from the bathroom sounding low and pleased, because she thought he couldn't hear her saying 3 whole weeks. And finally, then she said, no, he doesn't suspect a thing, and by the time he gets back those girls will be completely different. Then she said, trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing. And Thomas's fist squeezed tight under the blanket, because every word felt like a knife. And the next morning before the sun came up, he stood between his daughters' beds. And Emma moved a little bit, but Sophie didn't wake up, so he knelt down and whispered into the quiet, saying, I'm not leaving you, because I'm staying close and I'm going to make this right, and I promise. Then he walked out the front door for the last time as Thomas Hayes. And 2 hours later he came back as Jake Miller, after he parked 3 blocks away and put on the beard and the old worn clothes and the brown contacts. And he looked in the mirror, seeing that Thomas Hayes was gone, and the man staring back was ready to see the truth no matter how much it hurt him. And Thomas knocked on the back door at exactly 6 in the morning, with his heart pounding so hard he thought it would break through his chest. And the door opened to show a young woman standing there who was in her late 20s, with warm brown eyes and hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. And she said, you must be Jake, with a smile that was real and genuine. Then she said, I'm Susan, and come in. And Thomas kept his head down, with his voice sounding rough when he said, morning, ma'am. But she said, just Susan is fine. Then she stepped aside to let him in, saying, let me show you around. And she walked him through the yard, pointing out the gardens and the fountain and the hedges that needed trimming. And her voice was kind, but not the fake kind that people use when they're trying to impress someone, because it was real kindness. And she said quietly, the previous gardener left suddenly with no notice and just stopped showing up. And Thomas remembered that information, thinking, had the last gardener seen something too? So he said, I'll take good care of the place. And Susan smiled, saying, I believe you. Then she showed him the tool shed and explained where everything was kept. And as they walked back toward the house, she stopped and said, the children Emma and Sophie love the garden because their mother used to garden with them before she. And Susan's voice got softer when she said, before she passed away. And Thomas's throat felt tight when he said, I'll make sure it stays beautiful for them. And Susan looked at him with something like being grateful and said, thank you. And around 8 o'clock Victoria appeared standing on the terrace in her silk robe with a coffee cup in her hand, looking down at him like he was dirt on her shoe. and she said, so you're the new gardener. And Thomas kept his eyes down saying yes. Ma'am. Then she said, let's hope you're better than the last one because these hedges are a disaster, and he said, I'll fix them, ma'am. Then she turned and walked back inside without another word, and Thomas breathed out slowly because she hadn't recognized him at all, not even a little flicker of recognition, and for the next hour he worked near the house trimming hedges and pulling weeds. Then he heard it, which was a voice sounding sharp and angry coming from inside the house, so he set down his tools and moved toward the sound that was coming from the living room, and he stepped up to the doorway. And what he saw made his blood freeze because Victoria stood over Sophie with her face twisted with anger and rage, and Sophie's small body was pressed against the wall and trembling. Then Victoria's voice cut like broken glass, saying, I told you to set the table before breakfast, so are you stupid or just lazy? And Sophie said, I forgot, Miss Victoria. But Victoria said, sorry doesn't fix anything. Then Victoria grabbed Sophie's wrist and yanked her forward really hard, and across the room Emma sat frozen on the couch staring at her lap and not moving at all. Then Victoria hissed, saying, look at me when I'm talking to you. So Sophie lifted her chin with tears streaming down her face, and Victoria said, get upstairs. Both of you with no breakfast because maybe hunger will teach you. So the twins ran away holding hands and silent, and Thomas stood frozen in the doorway with his hands shaking and his chest collapsing because this was real and everything Emma had whispered was all real, and he forced himself to step back and pick up his tools and keep working, but inside he was screaming. And 20 minutes later Susan came outside carrying 2 small sandwiches wrapped in napkins, and she looked toward the upper windows, then slipped back inside through the side door, and Thomas moved quietly to reposition himself. And through the window he watched Susan enter the twins' room where she handed them the sandwiches and whispered something he couldn't hear. Then Emma hugged Susan's waist, and Susan stroked her hair with her face full of pain. And Thomas's throat burned because this woman who was a stranger was protecting his daughters while he stood outside helpless and watching through glass. And that evening back in his motel room Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off the fake beard slowly because his skin was raw underneath. And he stared at the recordings on his phone, hearing Victoria's voice sound cold and clear saying, your father works so hard for you and you can't do one simple thing right. And he played it again and again with each word burning deeper. Then his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria saying, miss you darling, and the girls are being so good and you'd be proud. And Thomas's hands curled into fists, and he typed back saying, glad to hear it and keep up the good work. Then he set the phone down and stared at the wall, thinking 2 weeks because he had 2 more weeks to gather proof and 2 more weeks of watching his daughter suffer and 2 more weeks of being invisible. But when those 2 weeks were over, Victoria White would learn what happened when you hurt the wrong man's children. And by day 5 Thomas had stopped sleeping because every night in that motel room he'd lie awake replaying what he'd seen with Sophie's trembling hands and Emma's hollow eyes and Victoria's cold smile and Susan, who was always Susan, quietly standing between his daughters and the woman who was supposed to love them. And that morning he arrived at the house earlier than usual when the sun hadn't risen yet and the air was cool and still. And he was trimming the roses near the side entrance when Susan came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and she said softly while handing him one that she thought he might need this, and Thomas took it feeling surprised and said thank you. Then they stood there in the gray morning light not speaking, and finally Susan broke the silence saying, you're not really just a gardener, are you? And Thomas's heart stopped, and he said, ma'am. But Susan said, the way you look at this place and at the house, and she paused saying at the children when they're in the yard because it's not how gardeners look at things. And Thomas kept his voice steady saying, just doing my job, ma'am. But Susan studied him saying, you have kind eyes, Jake, and sad eyes like you've lost something precious. And he couldn't speak, so she looked away saying, I'm sorry because that was too personal. But he said, no, it's because you're right. And Thomas's voice came out rough when he said, I did lose something a long time ago. And Susan asked the child. And he nodded slowly, knowing it wasn't a complete lie because he was losing his children every day a little more. And Susan's eyes filled with understanding saying, that's why you care so much. And he whispered, yeah, that's why. Then they stood in silence drinking their coffee as the sun began to rise, and for a moment, just a moment, Thomas didn't feel completely alone. And later that morning he saw something that nearly broke him because he was working near the playroom window when he heard Emma's voice sound small and scared asking Miss Victoria, "May I have my bunny back because the one Mommy gave me?" And Victoria's voice was sharp, saying, "That old dirty thing, and I threw it away because you're too old for toys like that." Then Emma said, But it was Mommy's." And Victoria said, "Your mother is gone, Emma, and gone. And the sooner you accept that the better." And Thomas heard a soft sob, then Emma's footsteps running up the stairs. And he stood there with pruning shears frozen in his hand because that bunny had been Caroline's last gift to Emma before she died, and Emma had slept with it every night for 2 years. And Victoria had thrown it away like garbage, and 20 minutes later Susan appeared in the yard, and she looked around to make sure Victoria wasn't watching, then walked quickly to the trash bins behind the garage, and Thomas watched as she dug through the garbage and pulled out a small stuffed bunny that was dirty and stained but still in one piece, and Susan held it carefully and wiped it clean with her apron, then slipped back inside. And Thomas's vision got blurry because this woman didn't know Emma and Sophie were his daughters, and she didn't know who he really was. But she was protecting them anyway by risking her job and her safety and everything for children who weren't even hers. And that evening Thomas sat under the oak tree pretending to organize his tools, and Susan came out to water the flower beds nearby, and they worked in silence for a while. Then Susan spoke with her voice barely above a whisper, saying, "She's getting worse." And Thomas looked up, saying, "Ma'am." And Susan said, "Victoria." Then Susan's hands shook slightly as she held the watering can, saying she used to hide it better, but now it's like she doesn't care who sees. And Thomas asked, "Why don't you tell someone?" And Susan's laugh was bitter when she said, "Tell who? Because Mr. Hayes is in London. And even if he was here, Victoria would just deny it and make me look like a jealous employee trying to cause trouble." Then she set down the watering can and looked at Thomas with exhausted eyes, saying, "I've worked for 5 families in the past 10 years, and I've seen a lot of things but this." And her voice cracked, saying, "These girls are broken, Jake, and I don't know how to fix them." And Thomas wanted to tell her the truth and wanted to tear off the beard and say, "I'm here and I'm fixing it, and I'm their father and I'm going to save them." But he couldn't do that yet. So instead he said quietly, "You're doing more than you know, because just by being here and just by caring." And Susan wiped her eyes, asking, "Is it enough?" And Thomas looked toward the house and toward the windows where his daughters were somewhere inside, scared and alone. And he whispered, "It has to be, because if it wasn't, and if Susan gave up and if she walked away, his daughters would have no one." And that scared him more than anything. And on day 9 Thomas was raking leaves near the twins' bedroom window when he heard crying that wasn't loud or dramatic, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep. And the kind that doesn't want to be heard. So he set down the rake and moved closer, and through the window he could see Emma sitting on her bed holding the stuffed bunny Susan had rescued, and Sophie sat beside her with their foreheads pressed together, and Emma whispered, "I miss Mommy." And Sophie said, "Me too." Then Emma asked, "Do you think Mommy would be sad if she knew we were scared all the time?" And Thomas's chest caved in, and Sophie's small voice answered, saying, "I think Mommy would want us to be brave, but I don't feel brave and I feel small." And Emma said, "Miss Susan says we're not small, and she says we're stronger than we know." Then Emma wiped her eyes, saying, "I wish Miss Susan was our Mommy instead." And Thomas had to turn away because he leaned against the wall with his hand over his mouth, trying not to make a sound. And his daughters wished someone else was their mother, not because Caroline was gone, but because the woman he'd brought into their lives had made them feel worthless. And that afternoon something changed, because Thomas was cleaning the fountain when Victoria's voice carried through the open terrace doors, and she was on the phone with her tone sounding casual and almost amused, and she said, "No, Richard has no idea because he thinks I'm some kind of saint." Then she laughed, saying, "Those girls were wild when I met them because they were spoiled and undisciplined, and someone had to teach them respect." And Thomas's hands went still in the water. And Victoria said, "I'm not being cruel because I'm being practical, because their father babies them, and they needed structure and fear works." Then she said, "Trust me, they're already so much quieter and so much more obedient." And she paused, listening to the other person. Then she said, "The wedding's in 4 weeks, and after that this house is half mine, and those girls will learn who's really in charge." And Thomas felt something inside him go cold, but not hot with anger. Instead it was cold and clear and focused, because this wasn't just about rules or control, and Victoria was planning to own his life and his home and his daughters, and she'd been planning it all along. And that evening Susan found him sitting under the oak tree staring at nothing, and she sat down beside him without asking anything, and she said, "You okay?" And Thomas shook his head saying, "No ma'am, I'm not," and they sat in silence for a long moment. Then Susan spoke with her voice barely able to be heard, saying, "I've been thinking about quitting." And Thomas's head turned sharply toward her, asking what, and Susan said, "I can't keep watching this because it's killing me." And her eyes filled with tears, saying, "Every night I go home and I can't sleep, and I keep seeing their faces and hearing their voices and wondering if today's the day she really hurts them." And Thomas said, "You can't leave them." And Susan's voice broke, saying, "I know, and that's the problem, because I know I can't, but staying means watching them suffer and being powerless to stop it." And Thomas looked at her, and really looked at her, because this woman had no reason to care and had nothing to gain and was breaking herself to protect children that weren't hers. And Thomas started to say, "What if?" then stopped. And Susan asked, "What if what?" And he took a breath, saying, "What if you're not powerless?" And Susan frowned, asking, "What do you mean?" And he said, "What if someone was watching and gathering proof and building a case so solid that when the truth came out she'd have nowhere to hide?" And Susan stared at him, asking, "Are you saying?" And Thomas held her gaze, saying, "I'm saying maybe you're not alone in this." And understanding slowly came into her eyes, and she whispered, "Who are you?" And Thomas's throat felt tight, and he said, "Someone who cares about those girls more than anything in this world." And Susan studied his face, looking at the fake beard and the brown contacts and the weathered skin. But she was looking past all of it now and looking at his eyes, and in his eyes she saw the truth. And she breathed out, saying, "Oh my God." Then she said, "You're—" And Thomas put a finger to his lips, saying, "Not yet," and "Soon, but not yet." And Susan's hand covered her mouth with tears spilling down her cheeks, asking, "How long have you been?" And he said, 9 days. And she asked, "And she doesn't know?" And he said, "No." And Susan let out a shaky laugh that was half crying, saying, "You came back for them." And Thomas said, "I never left." And they sat there as the sun set, with the truth hanging between them like something sacred. And finally Susan whispered, "What do you need me to do?" And Thomas looked toward the house, saying, "Keep protecting them just a little longer, and can you do that?" And Susan nodded with her jaw set, saying, "As long as it takes." And Thomas said, "Good, because this ends soon, and when it does I need you standing with them." And Susan said, "I will be, and I promise." And Thomas stood and picked up his tools, and as he walked away Susan called after him softly, saying, "Mr. Hayes." And he turned, and her eyes were fierce now and determined, and she said, "Give her hell." And Thomas's smile was cold when he said, "I intend to." And on day 12 Thomas arrived before dawn like always, but something felt different because the house was too quiet, and he moved toward the side entrance, and stopped because through the window he could see a light on in the living room and someone was awake, so he moved closer quietly. And Victoria stood in the middle of the room holding something in her hands, which was a photo album, and it was Caroline's photo album, and Thomas's heart stopped. And he watched as Victoria flipped through the pages that had pictures of Caroline pregnant with the twins, and Caroline holding newborn Emma and Sophie, and Caroline in the garden teaching them to plant roses. And every precious memory was in that book, and Victoria's face was cold and disgusted. Then she walked to the fireplace and threw the album in, and Thomas's body moved before his mind could stop it. And he was at the door with his hand on the handle, ready to burst in and to stop her and to scream. But then he heard footsteps on the stairs, and Emma's small voice trembled in the darkness, saying, "Miss Victoria." And Victoria spun around, asking, "What are you doing awake?" And Emma said, I heard something and I got scared." And Victoria's eyes got narrow, saying, "Go back to bed." But Emma said, "But I smelled." And her voice broke when she saw the fireplace, asking, "Is something burning?" And Victoria said, "Nothing that concerns you." But Emma stepped closer and saw the corner of the album in the flames, and her face went white, and she said, "No, no. That's Mommy's book." And Victoria said it was taking up space. And Emma said no. Then Emma tried to move forward, but Victoria grabbed her arm and yanked her back hard, saying, "Don't you dare touch that fire." And Emma was crying now and reaching toward the flames, saying, "Please and please, those are the only pictures we have, and please." And Victoria's grip got tighter, saying, "Your mother is dead, Emma, and dead, and you need to stop living in the past." And Emma said, "Let me go, and let me go." Then Victoria said, "Do you want to end up like her?" Because she was weak and pathetic and so focused on feelings that she couldn't even watch the road, and the words hit like being punched, and Emma went completely still, and she whispered, "What?" and Victoria said your mother died because she was careless and distracted and she got what she deserved. And Emma's scream broke through the night saying you're a liar and you're evil and I hate you. And Victoria's hand flew across Emma's face, and the slap sound echoed through the room, and Emma fell backward with her hand on her cheek and her eyes wide with shock, and outside Thomas's vision went red, and his hand crushed the door handle, and every muscle in his body screamed to move and to protect and to destroy the woman who just hit his daughter. But then Emma, Brenda, and Susan appeared at the top of the stairs still in her nightgown. And she flew down the stairs putting herself between Victoria and Emma saying don't you touch her, and Victoria's eyes flashed asking excuse me, and Susan said I said don't touch her, and Susan's voice shook but she didn't back down saying I don't care who you think you are because you don't get to hit a child, and Victoria said she needs to learn respect, but Susan's voice cracked saying she needs to be loved because she's 6 years old, and she just watched you burn the only memories she has of her mother. And Victoria stepped forward with her face twisted with anger saying you're fired, and Susan said fine, then Victoria said pack your things and get out of this house now, and Susan said fine but I'm taking Emma and Sophie with me, and Victoria said like hell you are, so Susan said then call the police and let them see that handprint on her face and let them hear what you just said about their mother, and the room went silent, and Victoria's eyes got narrow like slits saying you have no proof. And Susan said I have a voice and I'll use it, and they stood there locked in a battle of wills, and finally Victoria smiled in a cold calculated way asking you really think Thomas will believe you over me because I'm his girlfriend and the woman he's planning to marry? Then she laughed saying you're nothing Susan because you're just a maid and replaceable and forgettable, and Susan's voice dropped to a whisper saying we'll see about that, and Victoria's smile disappeared. And she looked at Emma who was pressed against Susan's side and trembling. Then Victoria said fine and you can stay for now, and Victoria's voice went deadly quiet saying but if you ever speak to me like that again I'll make sure you never work in this city again and understood, and Susan didn't answer, and Victoria turned and walked upstairs with her heels clicking against the floor, and the moment she disappeared Susan dropped to her knees and pulled Emma into her arms saying it's okay baby and it's okay. And Emma cried saying she burned Mommy's pictures and all of them are gone, and Susan said I know and I know, and Emma said I hate her and I hate her so much, and Susan said sure and it's going to be okay and I promise, and outside Thomas stood frozen with his hands shaking and his chest heaving and rage burning through every part of him, and he had just watched his daughter get hit, and watched his late wife's memory destroyed and watched a woman he'd planned to marry show herself as a monster, and he'd done nothing. And he'd stood there hidden and helpless, because the moment he showed himself the plan would fall apart, and the evidence would disappear and Victoria would use lawyers to get out of everything, so he stood there in the darkness and let his daughter cry and hated himself for it, and back in his motel room an hour later Thomas sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and the recording device sat beside him, and he'd captured everything with every word and every sound and every cruel vicious second. But it didn't feel like enough, and his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria saying good morning darling and just wanted to say I love you and the girls are doing wonderfully and miss you so much, and Thomas stared at the message, then he typed back slowly saying love you too and can't wait to come home, and he hit send, then he stood up and walked to the mirror and made a promise to the man staring back saying 5 more days and 5 more days of evidence. And then Victoria White would learn what happened when you touch the wrong man's children. And the next morning Thomas arrived at the house with his heart in his throat because he hadn't slept, and every time he closed his eyes he saw Emma's face with the shock and the pain and the betrayal, so he knocked on the back door, and Susan answered with her eyes red and swollen from crying, and she said quietly morning, and he said morning, and they didn't say anything else because they didn't need to. And Thomas worked near the house all morning waiting, and around 9 o'clock the twins came outside, and they moved slowly like they were walking through water, and Sophie held Emma's hand, and Emma had a red mark on her cheek that was still visible, and Thomas's hands squeezed tight around the rake, and the girls sat on the porch steps not playing and not talking but just sitting, and after a few minutes Susan came out with juice boxes and crackers. And she sat down between them asking softly how are you feeling sweetheart while looking at Emma, and Emma didn't answer. So Susan wrapped an arm around her saying it's okay if you don't want to talk, then Sophie's small voice said Miss Susan, And Susan said yes, baby. And Sophie asked, is Daddy ever coming home? And Thomas's throat closed up, and Susan's voice shook saying yes and soon. And Sophie asked, will he be mad at us? And Susan asked, mad at you, and why would he be mad? And Sophie said, because we made Miss Victoria angry and because we're bad. And Susan pulled both girls close saying, listen to me, because you are not bad and you are good and kind and brave, and what happened last night was not your fault, and do you understand me? And Emma finally spoke with her voice sounding hollow saying she burned Mommy's pictures. And Susan said, I know. And Emma said, all of them and every single one. And Susan said, I know, baby. And Emma said, now we can't remember what she looked like. And Susan's tears fell saying, you'll always remember because she's in your heart, and no one can burn that away. And Emma leaned against Susan's shoulder saying, I wish you were our mom. And Thomas had to walk away before they saw him break down. And that afternoon Thomas found Susan alone in the garden pulling weeds with shaking hands. And he knelt beside her saying quietly, you didn't sleep either? And she said no. And they worked in silence for a moment. Then Susan spoke with her voice raw saying, I almost left last night because after Victoria went upstairs I almost packed my things and walked out. And Thomas asked, why didn't you? And Susan said, because Emma grabbed my hand and she whispered, please don't leave us because you're the only one who's nice. And Susan's voice broke asking, how do you walk away from that? And Thomas said, you don't. And Susan said, but I'm so tired. And her shoulders shook saying, I'm so tired of watching them hurt, and not being able to fix it. And Thomas set down his tools saying, you are fixing it more than you know. And Susan asked how. And he said, by giving them juice and crackers. And by hugging them after someone else breaks them, and by being there, and by not giving up, and by showing them that someone in this world thinks they matter. And Susan wiped her eyes saying, it doesn't feel like enough. And Thomas said, it's everything. And she looked at him, really looked at him asking when, and she whispered, when does this end? And Thomas said soon, and his voice went hard saying very soon. And Susan asked how soon. And he said Saturday because there's an engagement party and Victoria's invited everyone who matters to her because she wants to show off her perfect life and her perfect family. And Susan's eyes got wide asking, you're going to tell everyone the truth in front of all of them? And Thomas's jaw got tight saying she wants a performance, and I'll give her one she'll never forget. And Susan asked, what do you need me to do? And he said, be there with the girls because when everything falls apart they're going to need you. And Susan nodded slowly saying, I'll be there. And that evening as the sun set Thomas watched through the window as Susan tucked the twins into bed, and she sang to them softly with the same song that Caroline used to sing, and Emma and Sophie held hands across the space between their beds with their eyes closed. But Thomas could see their lips moving like they were praying or just trying to survive another night, and Susan kissed their foreheads and turned off the light and closed the door gently. And Thomas stood there in the growing darkness watching his daughter sleep. And he whispered, I'm sorry, and I'm so sorry I let this happen, but it ends Saturday, and I swear to God it ends. And somewhere in the house Victoria was probably on the phone planning her perfect party and her perfect life. And she had no idea what was coming and no idea that the gardener trimming her roses had been recording every word and taking notes of every cruel thing and building a case that would destroy her. And Saturday was 3 days away. Which meant 3 more days of pretending and 3 more days of watching his daughter suffer, and then the whole world would see who Victoria White really was, and Thomas Hayes would make sure she never hurt another child again, and on Friday morning, which was 1 day before the engagement party, Thomas arrived at the house to find it changed completely because white tents were going up in the backyard and people carrying flowers went inside and people with food trucks were unloading everything. And Victoria stood in the middle of it all telling everyone what to do like a general commanding an army, and she looked happy and excited and completely in control. And Thomas kept his head down and worked on the far side of the garden staying out of her way, and around noon he heard Victoria's voice calling from inside saying, girls, come here now, and Thomas moved closer to the window, and Emma and Sophie appeared walking slowly down the stairs. And Victoria stood in the living room with her hands on her hips saying, tomorrow is very important because important people are coming, including the governor and business partners and family and friends. And you two are going to be perfect and understood. And the twins nodded. And Victoria said, I want you to practice with me right now because when I introduce you to our guests you're going to say we love our new mother very much, so say it. And there was silence. Then Victoria said, say it. and Sophie's voice came out barely above a whisper saying we love our new mother very much, and Victoria said again with feeling, so Sophie said we love our new mother very much. And Victoria's eyes got narrow saying Emma you're not saying anything, and Emma stared at the floor so. Victoria said look at me, and Emma lifted her chin where the red mark on her cheek had faded but Thomas could still see it. Then Victoria said say it, and Emma's voice was empty when she said we love our new mother very much, and Victoria smiled saying perfect and that's exactly what I want to hear tomorrow. Then she said you'll wear the white dresses I bought, and you'll smile, and you'll be charming, and you will not embarrass me, and is that clear? And they said yes Miss Victoria, and Victoria said good now go practice in your room because I want to hear it 20 times each, and the girls went upstairs, and Thomas stood there with his recording device running and capturing every word, and he thought to himself tomorrow because tomorrow it all ended, and that afternoon Susan found him sitting under the oak tree. And she sat down beside him without speaking, and they stayed like that for a long time. And finally Susan broke the silence saying she's making them practice lines like they're actors in a play, and Thomas said I know because I heard, and Susan said they're going to show off those babies in front of everyone tomorrow and use them as props to prove what a good stepmother she is, and Thomas's jaw got tight, and Susan said not for long. And Thomas looked at her asking are you sure about this and about telling everyone the truth in front of all those people, and he said yes. And Susan said it's going to be really hard to watch, and Thomas said good because his voice went cold saying she deserves that, and Susan was quiet for a moment asking what happens after, and Thomas asked after what, and she said after everyone knows, and Thomas said she leaves forever and my daughters get their lives back, then he paused saying and me. And Susan asked what about you, and Thomas asked do you leave too after all this is over? And Susan's eyes filled with tears saying I don't know what I want because I just know I can't imagine walking away from them, and not after everything, and Thomas said then don't, and Susan asked what, and Thomas said don't walk away, and Thomas's voice got softer saying Susan you've protected my daughters when I couldn't and you've stood between them and darkness and you've given them love when they had none. And he paused saying they need you, and if you're willing I'd like you to stay and not as a maid but as family. And Susan's hand covered her mouth asking you mean that, and he said every word. And she let out a shaky breath, saying okay and okay I'll stay, and Thomas nodded saying thank you, and they sat there as the afternoon light turned golden, and Susan whispered tomorrow's going to change everything, and Thomas said yes it is, and Susan asked are you scared, and Thomas thought about that saying no because I'm ready. And that evening Thomas watched as Susan tucked the twins into bed one more time, and Emma's small voice came in the darkness saying Miss Susan. And Susan said yes sweetheart, and Emma asked do you think Daddy will come home soon? And Susan's voice cracked saying yes baby and very soon, and Sophie spoke up saying tomorrow maybe, and Emma said I hope he comes to the party because I don't want to do it without him. And Susan said I know but remember that even when you can't see your daddy he's always thinking about you and always protecting you even when you don't know it, and Emma was quiet for a moment then said Miss Susan. And Susan said yes, and Emma said I think God sent you to us. Because when Mommy went to heaven I think God said those girls need someone and he sent you. And Susan's tears fell saying maybe he did sweetheart and maybe he did, then she kissed their foreheads and whispered good night and closed the door. And outside the window Thomas stood in the shadows with his own tears streaming down his face. And he thought tomorrow because tomorrow his daughters would see him again, and tomorrow they'd know he never left. And tomorrow Victoria White's perfect world would fall apart, and his family that was broken and hurt but still alive would begin to heal. And back in his motel room that night Thomas stared at his face in the mirror. And he thought tomorrow because tomorrow he'd take off the beard for the last time and tomorrow Thomas Hayes would come back. And when he did everyone would see the truth. And his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria saying can't wait for tomorrow darling because everything's perfect and the girls are going to make you so proud and I wish you could be here. And Thomas stared at the message. Then he typed slowly saying I'll be there and I promise. And he hit send and set the phone down, and smiled for the first time in 2 weeks thinking tomorrow Victoria because tomorrow you'll see just how close I've been all along. And on Saturday afternoon the big house was filled with people because 50 guests stood on the terrace under white tents, and there were business partners and fancy people from society and family and friends. and a group of musicians with string instruments played softly, and champagne glasses sparkled in the sunlight, and Victoria stood at the center of it all in a royal blue dress looking beautiful and smiling, and Emma and Sophie stood beside her in matching white dresses looking like porcelain dolls that were beautiful and delicate and easy to break, and Thomas worked in the background trimming bushes and keeping his head down, and his heart pounded so hard he thought everyone could hear it. And his friend Michael stood among the guests near the terrace doors watching and ready, and Victoria tapped her champagne glass with a spoon, and the crowd became silent, and she said thank you all for being here to celebrate this beautiful moment, and her voice sounded warm and nice, and she said Thomas and I are so grateful for your love and support. Then she placed her hands on the twins' shoulders saying, and I'm especially thankful for these two precious angels who've welcomed me into their lives with open hearts, and Thomas's jaw squeezed tight because open hearts, and she had no idea what those words really meant. Then Victoria said sweetly, girls, would you like to say something to our friends? And Emma and Sophie stood frozen, and Victoria said with a tight smile, go ahead, and Sophie's voice came out small and like she was remembering words saying we love our new mother very much, and the crowd made sounds of approval, and Victoria looked really happy. Then she pointed toward the house saying let's go inside for a moment, girls, because I want to show everyone the family photos, and they moved toward the French doors, and Sophie walked carefully trying not to trip on her dress, but as they passed the table with drinks her foot caught on the tablecloth, and she fell forward, and her hand shot out to catch herself and knocked over a big pitcher of cranberry juice. And red liquid splashed everywhere going across the white tablecloth and across the stone terrace and across Victoria's royal blue dress, and the crowd made gasping sounds, and time seemed to stop, and Victoria looked down at the stains spreading across her dress, and her face changed completely because the sweet mask broke and pure anger came out, and she said in a hissing voice, you clumsy little, and Sophie's eyes went wide with fear saying I'm sorry Miss Victoria and I didn't mean to. But Victoria's voice was full of poison saying you never mean anything do you because you're just careless and stupid. Then she grabbed Sophie's arm and yanked her close really hard, and the crowd stood frozen and shocked into silence, and Victoria turned toward the house dragging Sophie with her through the open door, and she grabbed a wooden spoon from the kitchen counter and raised it high above Sophie's head, and Sophie closed her eyes waiting for her to hit her, but someone yelled no. And Susan appeared from nowhere throwing herself between Victoria and Sophie with her arms spread wide. And the wooden spoon hit Susan's arm with a terrible cracking sound, and the crowd made shocked gasping sounds, and Victoria fell backwards still holding the spoon, and she said how dare you because you're fired so get out of my house, and Susan's voice was steady even though she was in pain saying I don't care what you do to me because you won't touch her. And Victoria said this is my house and my family and I'll do whatever. But a voice cut through the noise like a knife saying that's enough. And everyone turned to look, and Jake the gardener walked forward through the crowd, and his work gloves hit the ground, and he reached up and pulled away the fake beard and pulled out the brown contact lenses and stood up straight instead of hunched over, and people looked shocked, and whispers went through the crowd saying Thomas, and that's Thomas Hayes and oh my God. And Victoria's face went white saying no because you're in London and this isn't possible and you can't be here. And Thomas's voice was like ice saying surprise darling. Because I've been here the whole time. And Emma made a small gasping sound saying daddy. And Sophie whispered daddy's home. And both twins ran to him. And Thomas dropped to his knees pulling them into his arms and holding them like he never let go saying I'm here babies and daddy's here and you're safe now and I promise you're safe. And Victoria's voice shook saying Thomas the First can explain because this isn't what it looks like and she pointed at Susan saying she attacked me and the children are just confused. But Thomas stood keeping his daughters behind him, and he pulled out his phone saying would you like to hear what it really looks like, and he pressed play, and Victoria's voice filled the terrace through the speaker system saying those brats need to learn their place and fear works better than love and I'll make them call me mother whether they want to or not. And the crowd moved uncomfortably. And there was another recording saying your mother is dead Emma and dead. And you need to stop living in the past because she got what she deserved. And people made shocked gasping sounds and horrified whispers. And another recording played with the sound of a slap and Emma's scream and Victoria's cold voice saying you need to learn respect. and Thomas played recording after recording, which was 2 weeks of proof and 2 weeks of being cruel and 2 weeks of hurting them mentally laid bare for everyone to hear. And Victoria ran toward the phone saying, "Turn that off. Because this is illegal and you recorded me without permission," but Thomas said coldly, "in my own home while protecting my own children, and every lawyer in New York has said it's allowed as proof." And Michael stepped forward saying, "I'm Mr. Hayes's attorney, and Miss White, you have exactly 1 hour to remove your things from this property because the engagement is ended and all wedding plans are cancelled. And if you ever come near these children again, every recording and every witness story and every piece of proof will be made public and turned over to the police." And Victoria looked around wildly because her mother stood crying in the crowd and her friends backed away and her perfect image was breaking in real time. And she said, "Thomas, please, because I can change and I'll get help in therapy." But Thomas's voice was final, saying, "The time for help was before you scared my daughters and before you destroyed my late wife's memory and before you showed me exactly who you are." And he pointed to security, saying, "Take her out." And as they held her arms, Victoria twisted back with her voice rising to a scream, saying, "You'll regret this, and all of you, and I'll sue and I'll destroy you." And Thomas's voice was quiet and deadly, saying, "You already tried to destroy the most precious things in my life and you failed, so now get out of my house." And they led her away with her screams getting quieter as she went inside, and the terrace became silent, and Thomas turned to his daughters. And Emma and Sophie stood there with tears streaming down their faces. And Emma whispered, "Is she really gone, Daddy?" And Thomas said, "Forever, baby. And I promise." And Sophie threw her arms around his waist, saying, "You came back, and you really came back." And Thomas said, "I never left, sweetheart, because I was always here and always watching and always protecting you." And Emma looked up at him with her voice small, saying, "We thought you didn't know, and we thought you didn't see." And Thomas's voice broke, saying, "I saw everything, and I'm so sorry I didn't stop it sooner, and I'm so sorry you had to be scared for even 1 day." And Sophie asked, "You're not mad at us?" And Thomas said, "Mad at you." Then he knelt down and held their faces in his hands, saying, "You did nothing wrong and nothing. And you are brave and strong and perfect exactly as you are." And they fell into his arms crying, but not from fear this time, because it was from relief and from release and from finally being safe. And Thomas looked up to see Susan standing a few feet away, holding her hurt arm with tears streaming down her face. And he stood slowly still, holding his daughter's hands, and he said, "Susan." And she wiped her eyes, saying, "I should go and let you have time with your family." But Thomas said, "Wait," and he walked toward her with the twins following. And he looked at this woman who'd risked everything for children who weren't hers. And he said quietly, "You saved them when I couldn't, and you stood between them and darkness every single day." And Susan shook her head, saying, "I just did what anyone would do." But Thomas said no with his voice firm, saying, "Not anyone." Because most people would have looked away and stayed silent and protected themselves. And he paused, saying, "But you protected them, and you gave them love when they had none, and hope when everything felt hopeless." And Sophie pulled on Susan's dress, saying, "Don't leave us, Miss Susan, and please don't leave." And Emma said, "You're the only one who was nice, and the only one who made us feel safe." And Susan knelt down, gathering them both into her arms, saying, "I'm not going anywhere, sweet girls, and I promise." And Thomas's throat felt tight, saying, "Susan Miller, I'm not asking you to be their helper, and I'm asking you to stay as family and as the woman who actually protected my daughters when it mattered most." And Susan looked up at him with tears flowing freely, asking, "You mean that?" And he said every word. And she stood with the twins still holding on to her, saying, "Then yes, and yes, I'll stay." And the guests began leaving quietly, giving the family space. And Michael came to Thomas and put a hand on his shoulder, saying, "You did it, brother." And Thomas said, "We did it." And Michael asked, "What now?" And Thomas looked at his daughters and at Susan and at the home that had been a prison but could be a safe place again, saying, "Now we heal." And that evening, as the sun went down, the 4 of them sat in the garden, which was the same garden where Caroline had taught the twins to plant roses, and where Thomas had hidden for 2 weeks watching his world fall apart, and where Susan had stood guard, refusing to let evil win. And Emma and Sophie sat between Thomas and Susan, holding both their hands. And Sophie's small voice said, "Daddy." And Thomas said, "Yes, baby." And Sophie asked, "Are we going to be okay now?" And Thomas squeezed her hand, saying, "Yes, sweetheart, because we're going to be more than okay." And Emma looked up at the sky where the first stars were appearing, asking, "Do you think Mommy knows about Miss Susan and about what happened?" And Thomas's voice was soft, saying, "I think your mommy sent Miss Susan to us, and I think she knew you needed someone to watch over you. And Susan's tears fell, saying, I like to think that's true. And they sat there as darkness came, with the four of them together like broken pieces beginning to fit back into something whole. And it wouldn't be easy because the twins would need time to heal with therapy and love and patience. But they had time now, and they had safety, and they had each other. And sometimes that's where healing starts, which is not with big grand things or perfect words, but with the simple truth that you're not alone anymore, and that someone stayed, and that love, which is real love, doesn't give up. And even in the darkness, and even when it's hard, and even when it breaks you, real love shows up and it doesn't leave. And if this story touched something in you, and if you've ever felt invisible, and if you've ever had to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves, and if you've ever wondered if love really does win in the end, then you know this story was for you. And remember that sometimes God puts people exactly where they need to be, even when it hurts them, and especially then, because that's when miracles happen, and that's when healing begins, and that's when love wins.